Over the past year so far, we've been looking at words from the Word. And with that, we've been wanting to do a Bible study on particular concepts and ideas that are presented to us in the Scriptures in the form of single words. This morning's topic is one that I had a hard time with because I don't suffer from it, and that's pride. And so when you look at the idea of what pride is and what pride means, it is something I think is a plague to many of us. It is something we probably struggle with. We may not always understand how we struggle with it. We may not know some of the areas where we struggle with it. But this morning I want us to talk about this concept that really creates a very strong barrier between us and God. It's impossible to love God if we have pride because we have a love of self. It's impossible for us to really worship God if we have pride because we worship ourselves. It's impossible for us to serve and be mindful of God because we put ourselves at the center of the universe if we have pride. Pride is a very real evil, and it's one that's going to keep many from heaven, and that's why we need to be on guard against it. And so that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. So if you're ready for your 3 words, let's see the notebooks this morning. All right, very good. 3 words that are associated with this particular study. I'm not getting anything through here. Is gratefulness and arrogance. And the reason I have gratefulness first is because I do believe that there are some things that we should be proud of. There are some things that when we use that word pride or proud in our own English language, sometimes it doesn't mean exactly the same thing as when we see it in the Scriptures. But there are some things that we should be proud of, be grateful for, that we are very blessed with, that we should even boast about or glory in. And we'll talk about a few of those at the beginning. But predominantly when the word is used, especially in the Scriptures, it's used in a negative sense. And so we'll be looking at the word arrogance in connection with that because it is used a couple different ways when we think about it in our own language. First, there are some things, I want to get this out of the way at the beginning. There are a few things that we ought to be proud of. Even here in Galatians chapter 6, when it tells us in the verses that were read for us in 3 and 4, that if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, then he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone. He says, but God forbid that I should boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world. So Paul himself even says that there are some things that we should be proud of, and one of those is the fact that we do know Jesus Christ and that we've come to know God. That is a very real blessing that we have and something that we should be able to rejoice in and have glory in and be able to boast about to other people. That is a very real and tangible thing that is not braggadocious in the sense that it's inflated. You cannot overinflate the relationship that we have with Jesus Christ and the way in which this has indeed crucified the world to ourselves. In John chapter 3, verses 26 through 31, you have John the Baptist. And John the Baptist has been pointing his disciples toward Jesus Christ now. And he talks about the fact that in that context, John says, I must decrease that he may increase. And so one of the things when we think about things to be proud of and that we ought to be able to glory in, God is that way because we understand that because of Him, we can be made less and should be made less and are proud and indeed very, very grateful for being able to be made less. Even when you think about the future that you may have when it comes to your brethren, that Paul on many occasions would brag about the brethren that he had in Jesus Christ and that relationship and fellowship that he had with them. The Philippian letter is full of this. This congregation that Paul uses the word joy, something very close at least to 20 times, uses the word joy in talking about them and the fellowship that he had with them and making mention of them always in their prayers and knowing that their love that they have is going to abound still more and more. And what God had began, this great work in them, he was going to see it through to completion. And then in chapter 2, in talking about even young Timothy and that he had no one who was so like-minded that could serve as a child would with his father. That's the way that Timothy was. And that he was trustworthy in being able to send Timothy to them. And Epaphroditus, the one that was in their congregation that was a servant. And over and over and over again, Paul is able to brag about this relationship with his brethren and how humbling it would be to sit back and to consider the greatness of who our brethren is. One of the things when we think about those things that we glory in and honor and take great recognition of the gratefulness that we should have for them is it causes us to be humbled. It causes us to be lowly. It causes us to have a strong sense of desire and purpose in serving and wanting to do more. And when it comes to our God, when it comes to our brethren, it's certainly that way. And even when it comes to our families. We're told in Proverbs 17 and verse 6, a verse that's meant a whole lot more to me now over the past year and a half, almost 2 years now, when it talks about grandchildren being the glory of their grandparents. And that was something that I knew would be a very special thing, but I was in no shape, form, or fashion prepared for just how special that is, especially since you get to spoil them and do all these things with them, and then you just send them back to their parents. and they just think you hung the moon. But it's a very humbling thing also to consider this. In teaching our own children, and we mentioned this in our Genesis class this morning, in teaching our own children to be able to stand behind the cross of Jesus Christ and to stand up for the principles that God has given to each and every one of us. And then to know that not only is that generation right behind me, but even the generation behind that I'm going to be able to touch and affect and see and hear, and I pray to God one day see the obedience to the gospel and even my grandchildren. And that is something that God gave, and it's humbling. But because it is so humbling, we should be able to take pride in that. Even the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31, that her works praise her in the gates, but it says that her husband and her children, they praise her for what a good, godly woman that she is. So, brethren, when we talk about pride and talk about being proud, understand that in our language, when we talk about things that we are proud of, the Bible uses terms such as glory and honor and praise. But let it come from another and not from your own lips. Because predominantly throughout the Scriptures, when the word pride is used, it's used in referring to arrogance. And arrogance is an excessive view of oneself. It is a high or inordinate opinion of one's own dignity, importance, merit, or superiority, whether cherished in the mind or displayed in bearing, conduct, etc. It is arrogance, majesty, or haughtiness. And when you see those terms that are used, we know how distasteful that is. Several years ago when I was in Alabama, and as many of you know, that whenever we have Mother's Day, Father's Day, or maybe even some other holidays, I like taking some time to see what God has to say about some of these different roles. And this particular occasion, that Sunday was Mother's Day. And I gave a lesson talking about and extolling the virtues of a mother and talking about the memories that some may have of a good godly mother and some of the things that she would do in the home. And there were these two elderly ladies in the back that were listening to the lesson, and they were visitors. And after the lesson was over with, as they were about to leave the building, they said that was the best lesson on the subject of motherhood that they had ever heard in their entire life. And they said it borderline on being probably the best lesson they had ever heard in their entire life. And as they left the building, one of the other brothers turned to me and said, "I don't think they go to church very often." So you have to be real careful about things you hear and the things you may be led to believe. It is very, very easy especially when you're in a position where people are accustomed to having to walk past you and shake your hand, and you have to say something to the preacher about his lesson. And Bill and I were talking just a little bit before, and he said, you always know when somebody's got a problem with the lesson when they say, "Well, that was interesting." Or, I never thought about that. And you know there may be something that's a little amiss. But it is real easy to get an overinflated idea of who we are. And really, it's not just about the overinflation of the perception of ourselves, so much as it is that we make ourselves the center of the universe. That everybody is thinking about me. That everybody should be thinking about me. Everybody should be considering me. Everybody should be looking at me. And so what it really is, and I heard this definition this last week that I thought was really good, it is idolatrous self-worship. It is setting ourselves up as being the end-all and be-all of our universe. We are the creator of our worlds, and we are the only ones that can destroy it. And no one else has a right to question, and no one else has a right to invade. That I have all the rights and privileges that the world has to offer, and no one has a right to deny me those things. When you think about our world, not just today, but our world, that has been one of the central issues that are there. Did God say, don't eat of the tree? You won't surely die. Well, it is good for food. He's withholding something from me, is he not? And it starts at the very beginning. Really, pretty much any sin that you can think of begins with pride. And throughout the scriptures, there's so many verses that talk about pride in this negative sense. In Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19, among the list of those things that God hates, the one that is listed is a proud or inflated overestimation of ourselves, a proud look. In Proverbs 16 and verse 5, it says that everyone proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Though they join forces, none will go unpunished. In Proverbs 21 and verse 24, a proud and haughty man, scoffer is his name. He acts with arrogant pride. In Proverbs 3 and verse 34, surely he scorns the scornful, but gives grace to the humble. This is the one that's repeated in James 4 and in 1 Peter 5 when it talks about God giving grace to the humble, but casting down those who are prideful. In Proverbs 26 and verse 12, do you see a man who is wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for him. So when you think about what God says about pride, many people think that it is a sign of strength. But God says it is an evil that he hates, that it is a destructive abomination, and there's a better chance of a fool succeeding than a prideful person. It is a detestable evil in the sight of our God. And we need to understand exactly why. One of the reasons is because pride is a prelude to destruction. It's sort of like a ticking time bomb, if you will. It's one of those things that we know that at any moment it can blow up in our face, because we have this idea about who we are, and we have this idea of what should be in our lives, and before you know it, it can be easily destroyed. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. We know that this is one of those dangers we fall into when we begin to brag about ourselves. We think that the things that happen to other people will not happen to me, but it's just a matter of time. And one of the things that often happens is we believe that we are the exception to the rule. We believe that we can flirt with that coworker because it's not going to lead to adultery with us like it has others. We think we can socially drink or drink just a little bit because we're not going to become the alcoholic like others have. We think that we can dibble and dabble with things like drugs and being in the parties where these types of things are going on because we'll never become the addict or the partier like others. We never think it's going to happen to us. We think we're the exception. And that is one of those things that is so very dangerous. It blows my mind how often we talk about some of the dangers of not following this little thing called wisdom. That we want, as I've said many times before, we want an explicit command from God, thou shalt not do something, but we refuse to listen to wisdom. And that is prideful and that is arrogant, because the wisdom that's talked about through the scriptures is wisdom that comes from God. It is not man's common sense, because man does not have common sense. If we did, we would not sin. But we do not follow after wisdom. And many times we do not, because we think we are better. We think that we are the exception. We think that we are stronger. And before you know it, destruction is going to come. And it's going to end, as Proverbs 11 and verse 2 says, when pride comes, then comes shame. But with the humble, there is wisdom. It's going to end embarrassingly. It's going to end with, I told you so. It's going to end with, depart from me, you worker of iniquity. It's going to end with a broken home. It's going to end with an alcoholic. It's going to end with a drug addict. It's going to end with lost children. It's going to end with losing your soul. It ends in embarrassment. Is what happens. It blows up in your face. You can't take hot coals to your breast and not be burned by them. You can't do it. What you do is what you're going to reap. It's going to happen. God has promised it and said so. And there is nothing hidden before his sight. It is a shame and an embarrassment when we give in to pride. There's an example of this, I believe, in Luke chapter 14, where Jesus has went to this feast, and he notices at this feast that there are people who are coming in and they're taking the chief seat. They're getting closest to the founder of the feast, this place of prestige and honor. And Jesus, when he's observing this, he says to them, don't be that kind of person, because this is what's going to happen. You're going to sit there because you think that's the place you deserve. You think that's the place that you belong. That's in your mind the seat that was reserved for you. That's why nobody else is in it, because it belongs to you. And then the feast owner is going to have to come, or the founder of the feast is going to have to come up and say to you, could you please get up and sit down there? This seat is reserved for someone else. And how embarrassing is it going to be when you have to walk past all those people that you just walked past to take that seat, and now you're taking the lower position. Jesus says that if you have that way of looking at yourself in life, there's going to be an embarrassing moment. Pride goes before destruction, and it is going to be real. You are not the exception to the rule. And why this is so dangerous is because it promotes this self-sufficiency. You know, in 1 John chapter 2, 15 through 17, John is talking about the things in the world as opposed to the things of God. And he says that all the things of the world, when you talk about the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and then this one, the pride of life, that's not from the Father, but that's from the world. That's something you learn from the world, not from God. That is not something that's going to last forever. But when he's using this idea, this principle of pride of life, the New American Standard, I think, has one of the best renderings of it when it says the boastful pride of life. The word that's used there is where we get our word braggadocio. And these are often the individuals that will brag about what they have accomplished in life. They will brag about the things that they are doing in life. They will brag about and constantly talk to you about the reasons why they can't serve God is because they are so dedicated to their job. The reason I don't have time for God and godly things, maybe associating with the brethren, is because I'm volunteering in my community. The reason I don't spend time in Bible study with my children or my children being with other Christians' children is because we are very heavily involved in our school's activities. And what happens is we get this false sense of superiority because I'm doing so much. I've got such a strong work ethic, and yet you do no work for the Lord. I've got this strong sense of civic responsibility, and yet you spend no time with the brethren. I've got this strong sense of academic achievement and how important it is, but you don't open the Bible with your children. It's a way of shielding ourselves. It's a way of deceiving ourselves and thinking that I am so good because look at all the accomplishments I'm able to put on the board. And we say that look how much good comes from these things. And yet you did none of those things because of your relationship with God. You did all of them because it makes you feel better about yourself. That's how deceptive pride is. And that is the kind of pride that he's talking about here. It is the pride of life. It is the boastfulness of being able to say, look at what I have done. And it's not limited to just things of the world, but even in Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14, when Jesus speaks this parable to those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and yet they despised other people. It shows itself even in our religious circles. It shows itself in our worship to God. It shows itself in those ways in which we have deficiency and a lack of consistency in our spiritual lives. That this Pharisee could say that he was fasting and that he was giving and that he had done all these things, just as it is in Matthew 7, that there are those who could say to the Lord, look at all these wonderful things we've done in your name. And in both instances, Jesus says, I don't know who you are. And it was not this individual, this Pharisee, that was accepted. Instead, it was the one who could not even lift his eyes to heaven, but beat upon his breast and said, God, be merciful to me. I'm a sinner. How does it show itself? One way it shows itself is this: an inconsistent prayer life. If your prayer life is inconsistent, might I suggest that the reason is pride? Because why should you be praying to God when you don't really need Him? When you've got it all handled yourself. You've got it all figured out yourself. Might I suggest that it's pride? Because why should I pour my heart out to some creator that I've never seen? when I know exactly what I need and I know exactly how to get it. Let's not use the word pride. Might it be that you're so arrogant? Because that's really what the text is telling us. That you're so arrogant to conclude that I don't have to listen to what God has to say on that topic. And I certainly am not going to let somebody stand up behind a pulpit and tell me about how my life ought to be different. Might I suggest that the reason that we do that is arrogance. Because that's what God says it is. In Luke 18, too often we don't make a comparison. We don't show ourselves. We may in words suggest that maybe we have something in common with the Pharisee. But maybe the way that we do pray to God is really, God, I thank you for all these things because you're so very fortunate to have me. Because I'm not like others. And we forget who it is that God really shows his blessings upon and who he lifts up. Sometimes I think we just get tired that the things of God become a burden and a chore because it takes away from the things that I want. And we begin to use the word need. I need to do this. I need to do that. I have to go here. I have to go there. And all those things are the things that you scheduled yourself. And Sundays and Wednesdays do not come up by surprise to any of us. We know when they are. They happen every 7 days. We know when they are. The times that we worship, the times that we have Bible studies, they're scheduled pretty regularly. So when we know when we're going to have conflicts, because most of them we scheduled. Most of them we put on the calendar. And oh, what a weariness it is to give to God those things that are the best, when really the things that are the best are the things that I need. I'll just give God the leftovers. He should be happy with whatever I give him. Might I suggest that the reason we have that problem is because we are so arrogant that we become the center of the universe. The Bible also tells us that pride, and you can understand why, causes a great deal of strife. Proverbs 13 and verse 10 says very simply, by pride comes nothing but strife, but with the well-advised there is wisdom. When it comes to strife, we think about things such as, well, I can do this, and I don't need help, and I don't need advice. I can get away with this, because who are you to tell me? And why would God look at me in such a way as he does other people? It causes us to have problems in the church. It causes us to have problems in our marriage. Because after all, I'm not going to be the one who says I'm sorry. And realistically, have we ever had the words, I have sinned, come forth from our lips? Have you ever said that? I have sinned. We may say I'm sorry, but do we say I have sinned? It causes strife and it causes so many problems because, as we said, it's not that we think too much of ourselves so much as it is we think of ourselves too much. Because it's not just the individual that thinks too highly of himself. It's not necessarily only the person who has an overinflated view. But brethren, I think one of the things that causes strife a lot of times is the person who thinks that of themselves that they are too lowly or insignificant, that nobody thinks about me, nobody considers me, nobody takes the time to call me, no one takes the time to visit me, no one takes the time to shake my hand, no one takes the time to send me an email, no one takes the time for me. Might I suggest that that is arrogance? Because once again, you have put yourself at the center of the universe. The expression that I've seen on some people's face when they talk about things like that, and I have to tell them, you have to realize nobody's thinking about you. And that kind of proves their point. Nobody's thinking about you. No one's worried about you. No one's thinking those things about you. The only one that's thinking those things about you is yourself. Because you're so arrogant to think that you're supposed to be on everybody's mind. Why do we do that? Well, obviously they should. That's why they look that way. That's why they did that thing. That's why they walked past me. That's why they didn't say this. That's why they did say that. You are not the center of everybody's universe. It is not, you are not the sun and all the planets revolving around you. Pride comes nothing but strife. And the reason being is because we think everybody owes us something. Everybody ought to be doing something because of me. And might I again suggest, that's arrogance. Whether we think too highly of ourselves or whether we try to play the victim. In either case, it's arrogance. And again, that's why Satan is so good about bringing it to the forefront of our mind. That type of self-centeredness leads to a critical spirit where we get upset because the elders did not do what I wanted them to do, because after all, I'm the center of the congregation. When my wife did not do what I want her to do because I am supposed to be, or the husband doesn't do what he's supposed to do, or the kids, or the person at work, or the people in traffic that cut me off, because obviously that's where I was supposed to be, and if they were polite, at least they would have turned on a blinker. And we get a critical, harsh, angry, impatient, defensive spirit as a result. That kind of self-centeredness is what leads us to not associate with brethren. Because after all, they don't care if I come anyway. They don't care if I show up or not. Because after all, everybody there is going to be thinking about you, aren't they? We should have consulted you first, shouldn't we? We should have thought about you first, obviously. Again, brethren, something all of us need to hear. We are not the center of the universe. Stop putting yourself in the center of every scenario. It's arrogant, and it causes strife. Instead, a good attitude for us to have is that of the Apostle Paul. And it's amazing that when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 9, that he said, "For I am the least of the apostles." You think about the Apostle Paul, who wrote more books of the New Testament than any other, who probably started more churches than any other, quite possibly had converted more people than any of the other apostles. And yet when he held himself in comparison to them, Paul says, "I am the least of the apostles. I'm not worthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God." A few years later, when he wrote the letter to the Ephesians, in Ephesians 3 and verse 8, he says, "To me, who am less than the least of all the saints." Can you imagine Paul himself thinking of himself less than he does you and I? Of all the saints, Paul says, I am the least of them. Because this grace was given to me that I should preach among the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ. And the reason being is quite simple. In Galatians 2 and verse 20, Paul says, "Because I've been crucified with Christ, it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." That, brethren, if we want to conquer pride, and we're going to talk about humility tonight, but when we talk about pride, the greatest pride killer of all is that Jesus died for you. As arrogant as I can be, as sinful as I was, the enemy that I had made myself, and Christ died for me. And that when I gave my life to Christ, I gave all of it. I have nothing more to boast about. I am no longer the center of my universe. That all glory and honor and praise, dominion and power goes to Jesus Christ and Him alone. Him alone. And that if my life, my family, my friends, congregation I worship with, if they are worthy of praise, it's all because of Jesus Christ. So let us not glory in anything other than that. Jesus gave Himself for you. So the question I'm going to leave with you this morning is, are you winning that battle against pride? It is a daily battle. It's not one that's easily won. It's not one that's quickly won. And it's one of those battles that you're going to face daily. That every time you think, well, I've gotten over pride, guess what? You just sounded prideful about that thing. And so we need to understand that it is an ongoing battle, and it is a difficult one. If you're subject to the invitation this morning, if you need to be baptized so that you might be forgiven of your sins and begin a new walk with God, or if you need to repent of sins and need help in battling against this one, let us help you if we can. We know the struggle. We've been where you are. There was a time an invitation was given, and we were sitting in the same position that you are and said, yes, I want to be a child of God today. If that's you, please come as together we stand and sing.